So in the first part of this, we talked about kind of the theory, what the APIs are in terms of working with dialogs. And that's great. Those dialogs, those APIs are really, really great to work with. Really pretty easy to set up and use. Large in part, if you use them again, it's largely going to be either in an activity or a fragment. Occasionally you might create a prompt dialog from an adapter, but it will never be from a view model. Okay. So what I want to talk about in this section is some more concrete tools that you can use, some other techniques that you can use. These are more, this is stuff that I'm not pulling from the documentation. These are things that I've kind of cooked up in terms of things that you can do to try and make your code more reusable. Because oftentimes you'll find that you want to create a dialog that looks the same in multiple different places. And just using those APIs doesn't really make that really easy or obvious as to how to do that. So what I want to talk about is how can we kind of write more reusable code. You can find my example project here. There's a link to it, and you can pull that down from Discord. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. So a common case, basically this really comes in again, usually when I want to show the same dialogue in multiple places, right? So that may, this may be valuable if you're trying to do the logout dialog, but oftentimes maybe the logout dialog is just going to be on the home screen, so you're not going to get as much value out of this as maybe something else, okay? So what I want to start with is let's talk about how can we build a standard kind of confirmation dialog, an OK cancel dialog that I can use everywhere. I'm going to bring this down a little bit, push the font size up so we can see this a little bit closer. So here's a class that's reusable, like used multiple places to show a confirmation dialog, and it would be a little bit less code than trying to use the alert dialog or the alert dialog builder every time. Okay? So I've got public class confirm dialog. Now notice that this class doesn't extend anything, right? It doesn't extend dialog, it doesn't extend alert dialog builder. It's just an object. Is everybody there with me? That's actually kind of an important deal. That's kind of important to pay attention to. So technically, it's not a dialog. It's just going to behave like a dialog, okay? So this is kind of a technique of just containing an object instead of extending it, right? It contains a dialog, it actually isn't a dialog itself. But it behaves close enough to a dialog that I'm going to call it a dialog. Okay? So it's got one instance variable, private final alert dialog dialog. So there's the actual dialog. It's a member variable, right? Rather than the base class. Okay, there's one constructor. We've got the confirm dialog constructor. Notice it takes two things. It takes a context and it takes a message. Because for a very simple dialog, that's all I need, is the context to be able to create it and show it, and a message to show to the user, right? Which actually kind of makes this much simpler than using the API, using the traditional API. So inside of this constructor, I'm doing the work that I would normally do maybe in the activity. So I'm creating a builder. I'm calling builder.setMessage and setting the message that you provided. I'm calling set positive button and set negative button. So for positive, notice I'm passing two things. I'm passing the string, the text for that OK button, as well as a listener for it. Okay. Now, in terms of the text of it, I'm saying android.r.string OK. Now that's a little bit different. Usually we see things as just r.string.ok, the string that's in our package. Does anybody remember what that means if it starts with android.r? What does that mean?
It's the stuff that ships with...
Yeah. It turns out that OK and cancel are both such common strings that Android ships out of the box with the translation for both of those strings. So if I use the Android OK and cancel here, I don't actually have to translate that string. Java already will Android will already take care of me for that. So sometimes this doesn't work for most things, but for the rare case like this, where that appears in almost every app, they just go ahead and give you it, and it's already pre-translated, which is awesome. That saved me so much work to use this. Android to R instead of using R and having it translated myself. Okay? So I'm using a little trick there just to avoid the translations. In both of my listeners at the moment here, you can see I'm just logging. I'm logging OK is clicked, and I'm logging cancel is clicked. Or if the dialog is canceled, then I'm going to log dialog is canceled. Okay? Finally, we create the dialog. We save it to the instance variable. So notice at the point that this constructor finishes, I have successfully created a dialog and saved it to an instance variable. But it's not on screen. Does everybody see that? It's not on screen. So I also have two methods here, one called show and one called cancel, that just go directly to that instance variable called dialog show, dialog cancel. That way the user has a way to show or cancel the dialog without me giving them direct access to the dialog. I'm intentionally trying to encapsulate this dialog so they have limited control over it. Again, I'm trying to build something standardized that I can reuse. Does that make sense? If you wanted to be more Wild West, then I would do what we did in the first section and just work with it this way. But oftentimes this saves a bit of code. Okay. So again, as I mentioned, notice that this is not a dialog. It's not a subclass of dialog. But it's a good way to contain that code for a dialog I can reuse. Also note that I'm not passing any callbacks, right? There's no way for me to inject code into here that runs if you click OK, if you click cancel, or if you otherwise dismiss it by saying back on the device, right? So this is a start, but it's not sufficient because I can't actually run code when the operation is done. Everybody good with that? So I need to add a little bit more logic in order to provide the callbacks for when the actions occur. Okay? So that's where we're going to look at version number 2. So in order to provide callbacks, in order to provide these lambda functions, remember these lambda functions are shorthand for implementing an interface. Okay? Anytime you write a lambda function, that's a shorthand for making an anonymous class which implements your interface. So in order to provide a callback to my dialog, I need to define my own callback interface. Okay? So here I'm going to define my own onClick listener. Okay? So I say public interface onClick listener. In there I define the methods that interface has. So remember, for it to be a lambda, it has to have exactly one method. Okay? If I put more than one method in here, then it can't be done as a lambda. Cool? So that does mean if you need more than one different kind of callback, you're going to need to create different kinds of listeners. So I might, for instance, have a listener for interface for when the user clicks OK, or I could have a different listener when the user clicks cancel. Oftentimes they may need to be different. Okay? But here I'm going to use the same one for both sides. Okay? So it's void, it doesn't return anything. The method is called onClick. It takes an integer, which is that which variable. So that way I can pass in to there, did they click the positive or the negative button. Cool? Make sense? So I need to define that quick callback. I could define that interface in kind of two different places. I could define it in a separate file, or I can define it within the this dialog class itself. Okay? If I define it out in another separate file, then I have to be very specific about the naming of it, because then it's kind of the name is in the global scope, right? So if I was going to put it in a separate file, I probably wouldn't want to call it just onClick listener. I might say confirm dialog onClick listener, right? But if I put it inside of the confirm dialog class itself, then it's scoped to that, and I don't have to worry so much about that name overlapping with other onClick listener interfaces. Does that make sense? So oftentimes it's better to define these interfaces inside of the class that actually uses them, which is what I'm going to do. So at the bottom of the file, you can see in this version that I've defined the interface down here. Public interface on click listener. That means if I refer to this interface anywhere outside of this class, I have to refer to it by its full name. Confirm dialog dot on click listener. Okay? But within this class, I can refer to it by its shorthand on click listener. Cool? Okay. Back up to the top. Now that I've got that, I'm going to add 2 additional parameters to the constructor. One is going to take a listener for the OK button. The other one is going to take a listener for the cancel button. I'm going to call this on OK and on cancel. Cool? I might make a quick note on the annotations that you see here. You see I have not null and nullable. These are optional things that you can add in Java. They give the compiler more and more, your IDE more information about what you expect to be there. So it allows Android Studio to give you more warnings about when you're passing null, when you shouldn't be, or when something's not going to be null. So here I'm saying that the context can't be null. You have to provide me a context. I can't do my job without a context. The message can't be null. It says non-null because I need a message to build this dialog. Otherwise, there would be no content in said dialog. I also need definitely I need an on-click listener for the OK button, because again, nothing would happen with this dialog if you clicked OK and didn't have a listener. Okay, so that one's required. On the other hand, I don't necessarily need to do anything when you cancel it. In fact, that's the common case. Commonly, I don't need to do anything when you click cancel, so I'm going to make that one nullable, which allows that one to be null. So if I don't want to do anything when cancel happens, I just pass null as that fourth argument. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's what I'm trying to do there, is I'm giving the compiler some more instructions, some more guesses about what we expect here. So if I pass null where I shouldn't, then it'll warn me. Okay? So now, rather than logging, I'm going to do something in each of these listeners. So in the case of the user pressing the positive or the OK button, I'm saying, let's take that on OK, that first listener, on OK, and we're going to call the onClick method on it, pass in which button was pressed, which is basically always going to be the positive button in this case, and let it go do its thing. So that way this function is going to get called after the user clicks the OK button. Make sense? So otherwhere, where I construct this dialog, I can put whatever code I need into that. Make sense? Okay. Now, the negative button, I have to check first if they've provided me a cancel listener, because as I said, that is optional. So if it's not null, then we'll go ahead and call that on cancel listener. Otherwise, we're just not going to do anything, and the dialog's automatically going to go away. Cool? Third listener, set on cancel listener. At that point, if they've canceled the dialog by, say, pressing back, I also, again, want to call my cancel listener. I want to tell it, hey, the user's canceled it some other way. If you're there, I'm going to call you, I'm going to tell you it was the negative button, just as if they'd actually pressed the negative button. That way, both of these cases, as far as the user of this class, behave the same way. So you don't have to remember to hook up both of those things. I can just provide one listener that's called both places. Does that make sense? That ease your code a little bit? Maybe if you can see how we use this. So let me show an example of how this fits in. So using this is really simple. I construct a confirm dialog. I say new confirm dialog, pass in a context, pass in my message. So it might be like, are you sure you want to do that? Usually it's a confirmation of saying, this is something you may or may not want to do. You may have accidentally pressed it, so I ask, are you sure? Then I have my 2 listeners. Here I'm going to say, for the on OK, I'm just going to show a toast saying OK. For cancel, I'm just going to show toast showing cancel. Make sense? Pretty simple. And I hope you see that this might, in the grand scheme of things, save you a lot of code if you're using this kind of dialogue in a bunch of places. Does that make sense? It looks very much like I'm constructing a dialogue and then showing it. It's kind of meant to look the same way as the other APIs, but it's for a more specialized use case. That makes sense, right? This doesn't allow me to do all of the things that I can do with the alert builder. It's intentionally less flexible, but it's for those cases where we have a standardized sort of, here's a dialogue I may want to use again and again and again. Cool? So that's one way I can kind of write code that's more reusable. And in fact, another case where you might see this, for instance, if you're saying you're logging out, that might look something like this. You say, okay, when you press the log out menu item, we'll create a new confirm dialog. Context, message, put in a listener for the OK. You say, okay, if you do hit OK, then we'll actually proceed with the logout. Probably will be a separate function. Oftentimes I'll call that with the prefix do. So I might have like on logout and then do logout, right? So oftentimes the action that occurs when the user presses OK, I'll put into a separate function because it usually ends up being fairly large rather than putting it in the OK listener itself. That makes sense for everybody? Oftentimes that's something you want to go ahead and just make a separate function. And then in this case, if the user just decides, hey, I don't want to log out, well, we have nothing to do. We just pass null because I don't care about that. So if I pull up my example project, where do I have that up? It's here. Okay. If you have it up and running, you're going to see something like this. Okay. So I've got 5 buttons. That first button is going to show you this confirmation dialog that we just talked about. The other 4 are different variations of choosers, which we'll talk about on Monday. Okay. So this one, when we click that dialog, you can see it pops up what we just talked about, right? So there's my confirmation dialog. You can see that it's got the message. You can see that it's got an OK button, a cancel button. Those are my positive and my negatives. And you also see that it's got this kind of grayed out background around and outside of it, right? So I can hit OK here. You can see the OK toast pops up. I can hit cancel here. You'll see it'll trigger my cancel listener. And if I go back in here, I can also remember dismiss this by pressing back. Will get me out of here. Or I can click out here. That'll get me back. So basically, I've got 1 way to hit OK and 3 ways to cancel it. Does that make sense? That's a very big thing to pay attention to when we're dealing with dialogues. The good news is, again, most of the time you don't care about the cancel event. Usually you're going to pop this up before you actually do anything. And as long as you do that, then you don't have to do anything with cancel. Usually the case where you need to respond to cancel is if you started the operation and you're midway through, then you have to kind of clean up. Okay? So if you want to look at that code example, it's kind of what we just looked at in the slides. But it's pretty simple here. I've just hooked up a listener that calls show confirm dialog. There's my code right here that runs and shows that dialog. So that's one way to save yourself a little bit of code and make it bundled so that you can reuse it, again, rather than creating one every time. Cool? And you can extend that, you can mix and match that. It's not hard to say, hey, if I need something a little bit more, some more options, and maybe this is too narrow. If I needed to have different text for the OK button or different text for the cancel button, I could always add those as parameters to that constructor, right? Depending on what I need. Questions? All right, that's what I got for today. We'll talk more about the other half of that on Monday I want to talk more about kind of building lists and choosers and those kind of things.